This lesson on presentation aids will come in handy for you on a couple of speeches this semester, or it should anyway. Some may ask, why do we even bother using visual aids? Why don't we just get up there and talk? Well, the reason for it is, as you can see here, studies show that we retain 20% of what we hear and 50% of what we see and hear, and 70% of what we see, hear, and do. And so whenever you incorporate a visual aid or presentation aid into your speech, you are effectively helping your audience retain the information. And the more you incorporate into the presentation, the more likely it is that the audience will remember it. We looked at this in a previous lecture, the lecture on listening. The amount of information that we retain, we only remember half of what we hear immediately after it, 35% after a day, 25% after 48 hours, and we bottom out at about 20% retention, as we saw on this previous slide. Studies show we retain 20% of what we hear. So if all you do is listen, you'll remember 20%. But if you add a visual element, you you boost that retention up to 50% long term. If you see, hear, and do something with the information, you boost that up to 70% retention in the long term, which is all very good. There are various types of visual aids that you can use, and we will look at a few examples on the following slides. The point of a visual aid is to help get the point across without becoming a distraction. So you want to make sure that you don't overdo it and that you actually know what you're doing with your visual aid. Have a reason for it. Could use a prop, which is just an inanimate object used to represent something, to help convey a point. It's not a literal representation, but a figurative one. You have models, which are literal representation. It's a 3D to scale representation of whatever it is that you're talking about. So if you were giving a presentation on a specific type of house, well, you might bring a model of that house. You have photographs, pictures. We all know what a picture is. They say a picture says 1,000 words. The way I like to use photographs in a presentation is you use a photograph to say 1,000 words, and you just don't have time to say it. You don't throw pictures up on a screen just to use pictures, just to have something pretty to look at. They need to be there for a purpose. You have diagrams. Diagrams often used for schematics. A diagram is essentially a two-dimensional model. It's a rendering of something specific. Then you have graphs and charts, which are great for displaying statistical information. And there are a lot of different types of lines and graphs. It would be great for your persuasive speeches in particular, in your visual aids. You might use an audio clip in some cases to demonstrate one thing or another. You have some examples here. You could also include videos here. We use videos to show action. Generally, I advise against students using audio or video clips just because, technologically speaking, sometimes there are problems that occur within the speech. And so it sometimes becomes more cumbersome than helpful. Multimedia presentations are like what you're viewing right now. You're seeing print media, but you're also hearing a lecture, using several types of media within your presentation. We have some old school ideas, things like flip charts, which is like a giant legal pad. A lot of times you'll see those in business meetings. Sometimes you might see them in one of the few times that I've seen it was in a training session where I was put into a group and we had to work through an issue and then do a quick report. And that was the visual aid that we were given to work with. You have dry erase boards or chalkboards. Those are a useful medium. You need to consider things. If you know that's the medium that you have, make sure that you have chalk. Make sure you have dry erase markers or whatever's appropriate for your medium. Then you have handouts, which are often overlooked as a good visual aid. A handout is a very useful visual aid because you can literally send your information home with people. Give them something to think about. However, your audience may also become distracted with the handout if you give it to them too early. They may take to reading that instead of listening to you, so you need to time it properly. Most of you are going to use PowerPoint. PowerPoint is pretty straightforward. If you've ever used it, you already know it's not all that difficult to use. It's fairly user-friendly, at least for simple things. And that's what we want to do, is we want to keep things simple. So to avoid overloading your presentation, you want to follow what's called the 8x8 rule, which is no more than 8 words in a line, no more than 8 lines on a slide. You want to use a simple font style, not anything fancy like what you see there. Those are difficult to read, and especially in a big auditorium where you're doing a presentation or even a classroom. Those fancy fonts can be very difficult to read. You want to make sure that the size of the font is readable from across the room. My typical rule is if you can get up and walk across your room from your personal computer and still read the font well enough from across the room, it will probably be okay in a room where you're doing a presentation, a classroom or an auditorium. Make sure that your colors contrast, that your text is a different color than your background, a very different color. Like here, you basically have black and white. It's very easy to see. If you try to do one shade of blue over another shade of blue, it's very difficult to read. Or a black font with a blue background or vice versa, if you try to do red and black. Those are very, very difficult to read. You might have noticed that for the most part I stay away from the fancy transitions moving from one slide to another, even in a presentation like this. In most cases, there's really no need for a title of your slide to come flipping in from the side and landing in the middle, or for each line to materialize in front of our eyes. It's really not all that useful. There are rare occasions where it can be useful, but for the most part, I usually just suggest that you refrain from using those. Remember, when you are using PowerPoint, that it is a speech that you're delivering, not a slideshow, meaning you don't have to talk about every single thing on every single slide. You don't need to be relying on your PowerPoint. Your source of information when you deliver a speech is your outline. As a speaker, you should never have to look at the PowerPoint that is displayed. So keep it simple, just information that the audience needs to see in order to help them understand, but you as the speaker do not need to be looking at the PowerPoint or relying heavily on it. Poor presentations are easy to do no matter what the visual aid or presentation aid you're using. If you don't know how to use it, it can be more harmful than hurtful. So you need to make sure that you practice with your visual aid, make sure you're using them with purpose. If you get up and give your speech and it's the first time you've used your visual aid, that will be very clear to your audience. So you need to make sure you practice it.